everyone. I think we're going to get started in a few minutes, so if you can start taking your seats, that would be great. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily David. I'm a research associate at the Project 2049 Institute. Happy Halloween. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us today. I know that this is a sobering event, but as a form of trick-or-treat from the Project 2049 Institute, if you haven't gotten it already, we have some complimentary Kevlar waiting for you in the back. To begin, we will have some opening remarks from the Honorable Richard Armitage, and it is my pleasure to introduce him today. Currently, he is the chairman of the Project 2049 Institute, while concurrently the president of Armitage International. He served in government as Deputy Secretary of State from 2001 to 2005, and prior to that, he was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs from 1988 to 1989. In addition, he was in the U.S. Navy. He served on a destroyer stationed in Vietnam, and he has received numerous U.S. military decorations, as well as decorations from the governments of Thailand, the Republic of Korea, Bahrain, and Pakistan. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Armitage.
Thank you very much, Emily. And good afternoon. And let me thank our host in absentia, Carnegie Endowment. And before anybody cracks wise, this is not a costume for Halloween. This is me. This is all you get. Before I introduce our valued friend and guest, just a couple of words. You know, if you're here today, you believe, as we do at Project 2049, that the 23.5 million people of Taiwan deserve a voice. And they sure do. And they deserve to live in peace and security and free from the threats that emanate almost daily from the People's Republic of China. I was very proud to see our director of AIT this morning, Brent Christensen, put some pretty strong remarks out. If I shot across the bow, if you will, to our PRC friends when he said that any moves, I'm paraphrasing, to change the status quo by force would be very distressing to the United States, and there would be a reaction. So I think he's doing his parts, and today we're going to do our part and talk about a nightmare scenario. And it used to be, in a way, relatively, forgive me, Admiral, easy for military planners in Taiwan, as they were always looking west. But with the 360 degrees of naval and air forces, now military planners don't have it as easy. They've got to plan 360 degrees. And they may not have amphibious craft, but they sure do have roll-on, roll-off. So no longer, in my view, is an amphibious assault on Taiwan unthinkable. And particularly, it is thinkable if you think about the specific situation of a quick lightning strike into the Taipei port to establish sort of a beachhead, if you will. So what we're talking about is uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, and it is a nightmare scenario. But we've got to think this way. We've got to come up with the responses, and that's one of the things, not only talking about the various scenarios that might come, but how do we respond to it? And who could we have better to lead this discussion today than our keynote speech by Admiral Richard Chun, who's had just about any job you could have. Now, 40 years in the Navy counts as a job, doesn't it, Admiral McDivitt? And Vice Minister for Policy, Chief of the Navy, Strategic Advisor to the President of Taiwan. So there's not much. He graduate of the Navy Postgraduate School as well, President of NDU in Taiwan. So he's done just about all of it. And I don't think we could be better served today than to have our honored guest, Admiral Richard Chun. So may I invite you, Admiral?
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for your kind remarks. Good afternoon again. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I really consider this as a great honor for me to share some of my study and research based on my humble observation. This topic is very tough because in the service, we always hope for the best, but bear in mind, prepare for the worst. The scenario we call the nightmare or the worst case. Why we take this kind of scenario as the subject? Because we have to thinking about reverse from the button, from the worst case. Reverse thinking, trace back to what is the previous step. We made some mistake, or we cannot find a loop to have the other better approach or measures. Make this won't happen. Still, we have to consider what's the cost we can bear to manage to handle this scenario. We are facing tremendous pressure from the other side. Coercing by force, they send a plane, the ship circle around first island chain, not only around Taiwan Island. Luring Taiwan by market, compress Taiwan to Washington, and also isolate in the international society. So these are four measures simultaneously imposed upon Taiwan, not separately. Both across strait, China, Taiwan, we all familiar with Chinese Sun Tzu, the art of war. So you see, the grand strategy is to throw enemies' strategy. The second best is to throw enemies' diplomacy. The third best is to throw enemies' operation plan. The best, the worst, is to attack the enemy fortified area. But this four conception is a loop continuously. So the quadrant inside is simultaneously. This four line is a loop continuously exercised. How could we deal with this kind of pressure and without making mistake? How could we diffuse the crisis before it became the conflict? So from this metrics, you can see the Taiwan Strait scenario, the issue will be dominated by mainland China. U.S. maybe react. I'm not talking about the Taiwan's position, but this scenario, today we are talking about the single out, independent. Actually, the fourth scenario will connect to each other. They may happen simultaneously, continuously, depends on U.S. side and China manage the situation, diffuse the crisis. But the topic is the right corner. Diplomacy. And we're talking about the time frame. What's happened in the next 5 to 10 years? South China Sea issue, maybe connect to Taiwan crisis. So our time is very limited to build our capability, can deal with the threat in worst case. Everything is connected to everything. We cannot only handle the situation politically, economically, or militarily. So you can see all the leverage connect to each other. Today, we are focusing on military, amphibious, blockade. But before that, according to U.S. policy, you have to take care about your foreign citizens, their human rights, their privilege. You need to conduct the non-combatant evacuation operations. Before that, I do not see the chance for an amphibious or missile attack. And actually, Taiwan is not the weak point of the first island chain. So this is the cross-strait situation. You see the ADs. Taiwan ADs, Japanese ADs, South Koreans ADs, all covered and overlapping by Chinese East China Sea ADs. So actually, daily basis, there are thousands of civil plane, airplane, the military airplane operate, training, transit in this area. If the things happened, how could we limit it? The case only happened within this small box. So asymmetric warfare concept is to defeat enemies' operation plan. Overall defense concept and the CONOPS concept of operations. Strong defense, layer deterrence, enhanced air denial capacity, preserve fighting capability, attack enemy in the strait. We want to defeat them in littoral waters. The last is also the worst. We have to annihilate the enemy at the beachhead. This is the nightmare scenario, today's main subject. Not too complicated. This is more complicated. Unless we can have a fully integrated command control system throughout conflict, all the way down, can incorporate every single element of the sensors, shooters, and track every inbound missile, every inbound plane, every ship on the surface, generate a coherent picture, sharing with all three services. That reduced the miscalculation. But this system should be resilient. Redundancy. I want to thank our American friends helping us integrate with our local capability, which can support us generate this very complicated picture. But I'm very clear that every sensor, every platform, every shooter, their location, their capability, where's their location, force deployment, contingency idea. So this is a national generic chart, but tells us we have the capability to monitor the whole nearby waters, airspace. We're not going to make any mistake. Really want to facing the worst case, then we have to see the spectrum of the conflict timeline. This is a scenario, worst case, nightmare scenario, from D minus 15, 30 until D plus 30. That means the whole period can cover almost 2 months. We have the early warning. The other side, if you want to prepare any invasion, they need preparation, embarkation on different locations, unload, dispatch to different rendezvous location. No surprise. So it's a coercion. They can still send in their ships, conduct long-range exercise, circle around the first island chain, sending more long-range bomber fighters, to show they are enough to give us a strong signal or impose a very, very strong pressure. Depends on how you react. And normally we can diffuse this kind. Then cyber war. Cyber warfare is a strong signal to you that maybe we can jeopardize your finance system for a while, or can make you find that you are losing the power temporarily. Cyber. Maybe you lose your web page, email. This is important for all the young generation. So blockade and the cyber war can cover the whole period. Then they can shoot missile. The missile will not hit Taiwan unless U.S. side conduct new operations. You want to shoot American? You want to shoot Japanese? They have only selective target, sending the more strong signal because they have not announced this is a war. And also there's a joint striking operations. Lastly, today's scenario is amphibious invasion. Even the opportunities are very, very low. But as a military serviceman, we always have to study this. Then we're thinking trace back. Can we stop them in the previous stage, or we can diffuse crisis in the early stage? But you have to find the worst case. At the same time, can we make sure our electric power system will function well? Oil and gas, telecom, internet, banking system, finance system, freshwater, chemical, air transport, land transport, medical system. Those systems support the government, the right working order. So the government will running in a normal situation. It's not a separate case, say we can fight for how long, we don't care about the civil life. Then there's another consideration for our American friends, that is protect your foreign overseas American citizen, the NEOs, non-combatant evacuation. Shoot me, I will shoot back. So U.S. side have to evacuate citizens from Taiwan. In the meantime, they have to consider maybe I have to evacuate a citizen from Shanghai. Then this is a good timing. Could we sit down to rethinking how to defuse the crisis? Not by only impose more pressure by shooting missiles. So we pretty sure for a small battle in the very beginning phase, we can win the battle, but we need your help us to stop the war. Think in the worst case. This is the missile coverage. And our vital, survival depends on maintain and open sea land or communication, raw materials, products, energy import. So our last stage even focus on the beachhead, annihilate enemy, but on our backyard, we still have to secure it. So this is a scenario, very complicated modeling. If the other side used overwhelming numbers of missile attack, they can, after several waves of a missile attack, they can disable some fixed facility, even your fighters are well preserved in the bunker under the mountain, but you cannot generate enough sortie. So this is the first step before the worst case. But we know how to handle this. We can absorb many waves of attack, hardening our facility, distribution, relocate by mobile systems, sensors. We still maintain a fully integrated command control system, even under this scenario. Purchase count. And you can see the circle around Taiwan. That's our sensors, radar, UAV, can cover every corner. That means we still can control, monitor all the activity surrounding Taiwan. No surprise. Never ever have a surprise. I do believe. Then you will see this is a local firepower, land-based, small missile boats, stealthy boat, they can cover those areas around Taiwan and effectively against invasion amphibious forces. So this is the beach. This is a generic idea. It's not exactly the truth. There's no, because of the highly modern development of the Taiwan, all the beaches is no longer called a beach, no sand beach. Everything's a construction. So there's no beach allow a battalion level to engage amphibious landing because no depths of the beach. When we're talking about World War II Omaha Beach, you have 2,000 meters beach. We have less than 20 meters beach. No beach will disappear. Only the concrete made, the water break, pike over there. And then it's a highway along the coast. It's 10 meter high. So as long as your first company disembarkation after 10 meters is a Great Wall, you cannot penetrate. But we still have to prepare. If that happened, how could we stop them before they engage amphibious landing? So we have advanced mine warfare concept. We can manage make the mine smartly. We can call mine, go to sleep. We can call them wake up. We can find where's the leak. Then we can, replant another mine. So that can stop the invasion from the other side. If you try to conduct mine countermeasure under my artillery, no way for you to survive. So that can degrade the amphibious attack. So you see, we can use all kinds of mobile system, mobile missile launcher, mini missile boat. I'm not talking about the major surface combatant, only asymmetric weapon system. UAV, USV, UUV. We can delay, degrade, destroy enemy and landing forces. Even this is, the nightmare scenario. So the red is the best beach for landing, but now there's no beach for landing because without depths, the whole west coast, the beach is less than 20 meters. Depths, I'm not talking about 200 meters in width. So see this? So we need to use precise mobility, swarming, low cost, stealth, AI capable, a kind of a new high mobility, long range artillery, plus high mobility fighting vehicle. We have the confidence, pretty sure we can defeat them before they reach. Even this like Hawker-like, it's a UAV. We can manage hundreds of this. So this is only a imagination if they want to attack, but in actually there's no opportunity for them. This is from Google. You can see the river mouth of Danshui-he, and all the west coast is divided by highway, no way to penetrate. This is Taipei City, Songshan Airport, and MND, Navy Headquarters, Presidential Office. Google is very clear. Years ago, you have to pay the money to buy the picture. Now you have to pay more to let the other one cannot see the picture. 1,000 times. They will help you to blur, but they already get the location. MND, when I was chief of the Navy, the red building, that's my office. No good. So, how much is enough? to afford we engage this worst scenario. We need to spend the money smartly. Capability, readiness, plus requirements versus, the budget allocation. So affordable, accountable, equitable. We need to build a smart, sharp, and sustainable force. This is the ground vehicle, the tank, a fighting vehicle, wheeled. The Army is still in study what kind of choice, what kind of combination choice is the best. Can use those weapons before they can landing or even destroy the landing. Also, we need new weapons like artillery, more lightweight, mobility, longer range, to help them win the battle before they can reach the beach. And this is all the weapon system. They're produced by Chungshan National Institute. We welcome our American industrial come to Taiwan. We can cooperate together, sharing the R&D cost, and we can support each other. Maybe we can play the role as a supply chain. So this is the last page. Let us know. We understand the risk now. We are well prepared to face in difficulty, but we are thinking firstly, trace back to the previous stage to see how can we diffuse. Thank you. Thank you for patience.
Thank you, Admiral Chen, for that interesting presentation and for your remarks. Now we will go into our first panel, the PLA threat.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Kristen Gunnis. I'm the moderator for this first panel, and I'd first like to thank Project 2049 for having this event, for putting together this esteemed group of experts for this important discussion. So the first panel is titled The PLA Threat, and we have 3 experts today who will discuss aspects of the PLA's modernization and capabilities and how that's affecting China's capacity for use of military force against Taiwan. As many of you know, the PLA is pursuing an ambitious military modernization and organizational reform agenda that's building capabilities aimed at a potential Taiwan scenario and at degrading core U.S. operational capabilities should the U.S. come to Taiwan's assistance. Some of these capabilities, which the panelists will further discuss, include growing naval and amphibious capabilities, as the PLA Air Force and PLA Navy Marine Corps in particular continue to equip, plan, and train for sustained amphibious operations. Growing PLA capabilities also include increased space and cyberspace capabilities, recently embodied with the creation of the Strategic Support Force in 2015, which handles cyber, electronic warfare, and information operations, which the PLA views as a key to gaining information dominance in the battlefield. So we have much to discuss in this next hour, and I'll first introduce the panelists. They'll speak for about 10 to 12 minutes each, and then we'll take some questions. So you have the panelists' bios with you, and I encourage you to take a look at their backgrounds. But briefly, the first speaker will be Rick Fisher, who's a senior fellow on Asian military affairs at the International Assessment and Strategy Center, and he'll provide an overview of how the PLA may get to Taiwan, developments in amphibious assault armor and airborne mechanization, and ground force threats. Second will be Mark Stokes, the Executive Director of Project 2049, who will discuss advancements in PLA battlefield ISR. And last but not least will be Dr. Scott Harold, the Associate Director at the Center for Asia-Pacific Policy at the RAND Corporation, who will discuss the challenges the PLA would face in a Taiwan invasion scenario. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rick Fisher.
Kristen, thank you. And I'd also like to begin by thanking Project 2049, not only for holding this event on this most auspicious of days, but also thank them for entertaining my views on this. And I will try not to disappoint. My mission here will be to try to scare as much as possible. I will be focusing on specific aspects of PLA developments, threat developments, not all of them, and I will leave it to my colleagues, Scott, Mark, Fume, to provide the reassurance, and if they fail, there's whiskey in the back. Now, I plan on simply looking at this threat in three major areas. How has the PLA's ability to get to Taiwan improved? How is mechanization, a movement toward medium-weight armor, how is that going to make a big difference? And third, to look at some developments in close air support. We are here largely because of a gathering concern that the PLA is indeed soon to reach a point where it could consider the option of actually invading Taiwan, as horrible and as much impact as that would have. The intersection of strategy reforms, doctrine reforms, restructuring, and the completion of essentially a fourth-generation level of re-equipment all intersects by the early 2020s. And there are also key anniversaries that the Chinese leadership is facing and stated objectives, vaguely put, to essentially be the dominant power on the globe by 2050, 2049. It is also clear that the U.S. government takes this threat very seriously. In a quiet manner, so as not to promote panic, I think there has been a very vigorous effort over the last 5 years, 2 administrations, to vigorously convince the government of Taiwan to spend more on defense and to target that spending on capabilities that can deter and then defeat possible invasion. I think that at a professional level, Washington has concluded that this is a real danger, and it is high time to take corrective measures as quickly as possible. Now, in addressing the invasion scenario, I would offer 2 big caveats. One is that which has been offered many times in conferences and examinations over the last 20 years, is that a successful invasion would require overwhelming superiority by the PLA, successful concealment of enormous preparations, very rapid mobilization, excellent coordination, excellent weather, successful capture of ports and airfields, excellent good luck. If you want to know a lot more about all these cautions, then I strongly suggest 2049 scholar Ian Easton's recent book. But then I would offer an even bigger caveat, number 2. The necessity for big caveat number 1 relaxes significantly if the PRC's missile and likely nuclear assistance to North Korea enables a crisis that sufficiently ties down the United States to allow greater opportunity for the PLA. And just in reporting today, recently retired Lieutenant General Hodges yesterday told a reporter about his fear of the United States and China becoming engaged in a war. He then modified that by telling a good friend of many of us, Gordon Chang, that the possibility of a simultaneous war with China and Russia is also a concern of his. And that simultaneous war would likely involve scenarios either on the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Strait, or both. Now, the biggest nightmare is China's persistent pursuit of a tunnel under the Taiwan Strait to permanently link Taiwan to the mainland and thus provide a logistic avenue to deploy power as it sees fit. It's not something that any government in Taiwan is ready to let happen. But the Chinese actually persist. They've been at this for a long time. They have plans that are starting to gel. And they do have capability. They have enough, they have purchased enough tunneling equipment over the last 20 plus years that once they finish building all their missile tunnels, they can devote all that tunneling equipment to a project like this. Now, in terms of getting to Taiwan, what concerns me the most are developments in airlift. But first, looking at formal airlift, it's not impressive. Maybe 35 heavy transports, 50 to 60 medium transports. Certainly plans to develop larger aircraft. The helicopter force, though, is coming along quickly. About 1,000 helicopters in the PLA ground forces. Ambitions expressed informally to build up to 3,000, sort of what we have. Heavy helicopter program is underway with the Russians, and there are bi and quad tilt rotor programs underway. The more scary part is if the PLA succeeds in capturing airfields on Taiwan, then informal airlift could make a much more decisive difference in securing the island. Chinese airliners. Chinese have about 3,000 Boeing and Airbus airliners. They can carry about 1.6 million passengers a day. But what about the throughput into Taiwan? Taiwan's 6 largest airports can process about 175,000, or about 5.3 million a month. But for the PLA, of course, the rate would be a bit higher because they don't have to go through customs and immigration. Now, here's a number to keep in mind. There are about 8.6 million households, families in Taiwan. If you assume the event that the Chinese are going to want to pacify and re-educate Taiwanese like they're doing to Uyghurs in Xinjiang, putting actual Han Chinese in families, about 1 million so far, it is conceivable that China could transport about 8 million Chinese to Taiwan in about a month. Again, assuming control of intact airfields. Sea lift is moving along. Formal sea lift, big ships, LPDs, LHDs are on the way. You add it up informally, maybe they could transport up to about 4 divisions. And I certainly appreciate the Admiral's comments, and others will also talk about the difficulty of the Taiwan terrain. But here we see a rare example of the PLA building a temporary dock out to ships. I assume that we'll see a lot of that, a lot of temporary docks off of appropriate areas to supplement limited access to the beaches. But informal sea lift is much greater and of concern. In 2009, a World Bank report co-authored by Chinese Ministry of Transportation experts stated that China had over 100,000 self-propelled inland water barges. Many of these were used to build the bases in the Spratlys. Roll-on, roll-off barges like that you can buy on Alibaba for about $2, $3, $4 million a piece. roll-on, roll-off passenger ferries, large car and truck transports, those made in China, have to meet specifications in order to allow them to carry heavy military payloads. About 5 years ago, I was told of a Taiwanese estimate that with all of this sea lift mobilized, the PLA could move maybe 8 to 12 divisions, roughly 80 to 120,000 troops. How many waves of this could the PLA get away with? And then, if they get to the beach, okay, looks like we're going to need somebody to advance the slides or take that. But at any rate, PLA has invested heavily in now a third generation of amphibious armor. As many of you might be familiar with the ZBD-05 family, numerous variants devoted to logistically sustaining armor on the beach and for breaching missions. The PLA has developed mobile rocket artillery to take care of mines on the beaches, and even other amphibious assault equipment like surfaces rolled out from the backs of vehicles to deal with Taiwan's difficult beach sand conditions. There you go. Okay, thank you. And next, once they get to the beach, and we should also remember that the assault vehicles are armed with 105 millimeter cannon that fire gun-launched guided missiles, anti-tank missiles, 4 to 5 kilometer range, and they can be fired from the floating platform as it's coming to the beach. Medium weight armor is also developing very quickly based on the ZBD-09 platform. We now have an entire family, 12, 15 variants of medium weight mechanized armor based on this chassis. Artillery, anti-aircraft artillery, new assault gun equipped, and light tanks. The PLA has just reintroduced light tanks. What's important is that all of this is much easier to transport on the ferries, on the barges. And we're also seeing the beginning of the introduction of active protection systems. So Taiwan's emphasis on shoulder-launched, sophisticated, powerful anti-tank missiles like the Javelin is now getting a response. Moving along here. More medium weight armor for the ground forces. The airborne forces are also being mechanized with lightweight systems, but also in the last 2 years we've seen new air-droppable 122 millimeter artillery systems. Adds a lot of punch once you get on the ground. Special forces are also being mechanized. So you can come in by helicopter at either end of the airport, and you don't have to run, you can ride. That also makes a big difference. In terms of air support, it's my contention that if the PLA were to replace the same number of short-range ballistic missile transporter erector launchers that it has today, well, the last unclassified number for these launchers was provided by the Pentagon in 2010. If all of those launchers were replaced by second-generation SRBMs, because the second generation can carry 2, 5, or 8 missiles apiece, the PLA could increase the number of SRBMs to well over 4,000. That would be a big difference. In terms of aerial close air support, the PLA, there are now almost, I believe, 5 Chinese companies that are making precision-guided weapons. Not all of them are getting into the PLA, but a lot of them are. The H-6K was recently revealed to be a bomber that could carry up to 36 precision-guided bombs. Unmanned combat aerial vehicles are a little slow to get into the PLA, but this is picking up. They have a Predator 1, and they're just starting to introduce a Predator 2 class UCAV, and we've just recently learned that at the Zhuhai Air Show next week, a carrier-based UCAV will be introduced. Attack helicopters are probably close to 500 in number. Also, another important capability. In terms of combat aircraft, in 2014, I was told of estimates that by 2020, the PLA could have over 1,500 advanced 3+, 4+ generation combat aircraft. This is F-16 capable multi-role combat aircraft versus Taiwan, which probably won't have more than 300 ever. And these aircraft are being equipped with sophisticated weapons. New air-to-air missiles that outrange the AMRAAMs that Taiwan has, hypersonic ground attack missiles, possibly an anti-ship version of that in development, and much longer range, 300, 400 kilometer range air-to-air missiles, dual guidance, difficult to fox, difficult to defend against. Okay, I am done. I don't see anybody running for the whiskey yet, so maybe I haven't done my job. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Rick. For more good news, we turn to Mark Stokes.
Okay. Oops. Right, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rick, for a very compelling presentation. Very informative. Also, thanks to our staff for putting this event together. Makes my job fairly easy, and I'm quite pleased to be just a regular presenter, a speaker today, to talk about one of my favorite subjects. And the topic of my pitch today is on PLA reconnaissance strike operations. Now, what does this have to do with an amphibious landing, a nightmare scenario? To put it in a broader context, and I'm just going to throw this out there and try to link back to it in my concluding remarks. But in, I think it was last week, I think the Trump administration announced possible intent to review the U.S. commitment to our agreement with the former Soviet Union, Russia, on the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, or INF Treaty. And I'll link back, but the INF Treaty and some of the references to China are quite relevant when you start looking at this additional problem that could turn into an even worse nightmare. So with this, when I say reconnaissance strike operations, really what I'm talking about is the combination of command and control, communications, and of course computers that go in to support these, as well as intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR for short. What Rick outlined is sort of the front end. It's a pointy end of the spear of a nightmare scenario. It is the forces going in. What I'm going to address here a little bit are the ones that are in the back a little bit. They're actually directing these individual components, the ones that are commanding these forces. And it's a complicated operation, and I hope to be able to show you why it would be complicated. So with that in mind, let me talk just a little bit about what I mentioned before, the command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, C4ISR, in short. Talk a little bit about national level C4ISR. The PLA is just not going to do this on their own. They're going to have, obviously, because this is a significant operation. If they lose, it threatens the stability of the Chinese Communist Party in general. And a pretty good chance that could happen, which is not bad for deterrence. Look a little bit about PLA theater, command and control system, the ISR part of this. Communications is critical. It's also a very significant vulnerability. And a little bit about the often forgotten subject of electronic countermeasures or electronic warfare, and then conclude a bit. The command and control is critical. It's these, because when you look at any warfare, what you're really looking at is a competition between commanders. Also politically, democratically, or also between political leaderships and the military leaderships at different levels: strategic level or national, operational level. Now, there's ones in the theater, and then tactical level, which are forces in the field. To put simply, national command and control system of the Chinese Communist Party and their state alter ego, the People's Republic of China, the PLA, concentrated. If anybody's ever been to Beijing, the northwest part of Beijing. Sort of that's their national military command and control center in a mountain up there. But that may not be the primary one. Their command and control centers are going to be very similar to what we would have or used to have in the Pentagon, which is something like a NMCC, in a basement somewhere, but to be closer to the day-to-day military leadership. But you're going to have, for military operations other than war, possibly a different command and control system. But you're also going to have national level ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance support. And this links back into the establishment of the PLA Strategic Support Force, as Chris mentioned, in December of 2015. It's still evolving, but this is a significant capability. But it goes, it links in space-based reconnaissance, space tracking. In other words, they want to know what U.S. satellites and other space capabilities that are out there. It provides, in their lexicon, technical reconnaissance, or communications intelligence for short, of which cyber is one approach, one part of this. And there's a uncertain relationship with other parts of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance community, that is Air Force and Navy. Communications is the glue that links these command and control elements together. All the way down to the tactical level. The capabilities that Rick was describing, people have to communicate with each other, which can be a vulnerability. But it's also ensuring those communications are protected, which both in terms of crypto, basically keying material that protects the integrity of their networks. And there's a lot that goes into this. Spectrum, when I say spectrum management, what I mean here is that Taiwan arguably is the densest radio frequency environment in the world. In the sense of the number of, in a very compact area, the number of cell phones that are going on, signals flying through the air, number of cell phones, the radar, all kinds of things that are flying in there. PLA operation is going to make that a very, very complicated environment. They place spectrum management very high in terms of their priority list for a contingency operation. National command and control at the national level. There's different, it's not the commanders that are going to be assembled wherever their command and control center is or would be, is going to be supported by a number of cells that are going to be supporting them for strategic targeting, for airspace management. Airspace management is complicated, particularly in a nightmare scenario. Spectrum management, survey and mapping, all the way to coordinating electronic countermeasures, all kinds of things. Weather becomes very important in this scenario as well. So going down to the theater level, an operation of using the capabilities, again, that Rick had described, again, is going to be commanded and controlled by a set group of officers at the theater level. Today, it is the PLA Eastern Theater Command, which was established around the same time as the PLA Strategic Support Force, or a little bit afterwards. Based upon the former Nanjing military region, and there are specific individuals right now that are in command. They will change every year, 2 years, 3 years, but right now you have a commander and political commissar. Political commissar functions as the secretary of the Eastern Theater Command party committee. We often forget about the PLA's political military system. This is not just a system of political commissars, but it is the system that would run all of the fake news that you see injected into Taiwan society today, in terms of through social media. If you think it's bad now, just wait. in the lead up to conflict like this in terms of trying to, again, inject false or deceptive information into among Taiwan's populace and America's populace for that matter. The political work system is critical. You're going to have deputy commanders, you're going to have deputy political commissars, and the three main components, Army, Navy, Air Force, they're going to be there. In a wartime situation, you would also add to that the PLA rocket force. That's their missile forces, and I'll discuss that here in a little bit. At the national level, though, they're not going to let Eastern Theater Command operate on their own. So you're going to have national level authorities, military. You're also going to have political, but military authorities that are also going to be very intimately involved in connecting the theater level with the national level. And they have quite a few. They have a couple of interesting former rocket force people. Their nuclear or conventional missile forces have gained a more prominent profile within their national level command authority. Strategic Support Force leadership as well. ISR, that component, is critical to something on a scale of an amphibious invasion. They don't know where targets are. And this is the organization that would provide national level ISR support. So let's go, again, going back to the theater level. You have Eastern Theater Command would have a command and control center. Matter of fact, they would have more than just one. They'd have probably would have something like a primary command and control center. They could have a forward command and control center closer to the area of operations directly. They would have for example, a backup command and control center, and they could even have a command and control center dedicated to logistics. But it doesn't stop there. They have command and control. They would have command centers for Army, each of the services, theater level services, Army, Navy, Air Force. Army Theater, the Eastern Theater Command Army, again, is a relatively new organization. As the title of their military wing implies, the People's Liberation Army. The Army used to be one with their general staff in their system. Now they've spun off the Army into a separate dedicated system. The Army, the Theater Command Army, interestingly enough, it's in Fuzhou. Why is this interesting? It may even be where the former Fuzhou military region used to reside. Why is this important? Because when they established the Fuzhou military region in 1956, it was intended to be, it had practical implications, but also had significant symbolic significance. And I'm not sure if there's a connection between them putting the newly established Army Theater Component Command where the old Fuzhou military region command used to be in Fuzhou, but interesting nonetheless. Air Force has their own component, as well as the EC Fleet / Eastern Theater Command Navy that has their own. In peacetime, PLA rocket force, separate command and control system. However, in a contingency, they would be certainly certain parts of the rocket force would be integrated. Very busy chart, but just let's say the command and control system is critical. And finding and knowing where those command and controls systems are absolutely critical at the theater level. And again, they're going to have different centers the way they're structured. ISR becomes very important. There's probably a new strategic support force element that's attached to the Eastern Theater Command. But each service, again, has their own, besides the PLA strategic support force, each service has their own ISR support elements. Army, very interesting, there's a new brigade in Eastern Theater Command, and every theater command for that matter, that is known as an intelligence reconnaissance brigade. This appears to be a linkage of special forces. It's like armed special forces that are geared toward reconnaissance operations and established there. Their UAVs and all their various systems. Theater Air Force, the flights around Taiwan, both bomber and then the reconnaissance systems, are all Air Force assets. Got it. And the Navy, of course, has their own system as well. Air surveillance, they're in their command and control system, they're naturally going to be concerned about the potential interdiction of their command and control system. Interdiction mean deep interdiction. It's not offensive because Taiwan's defense strategy is inherently defensive. They're not the ones invading. They give up on the Fan Gong Dalu a long time ago. And so it's not that. So going after the command and control system becomes very relevant. And air surveillance system becomes part of this in terms of and their air defenses. Give you a sense on the density of their air surveillance systems. Information communications becomes very important, and it's critical to know where their communications nodes are. In their intelligence system, being able to listen in on communications, like whether it's civilian communications on Taiwan, all your cell phone networks, being able to look at ROC, Republic of China Army networks, Republic of China Air Force networks, Republic of China Navy networks are critical, and this is part of the solution that they have to monitor these networks. There's a whole series of huge, very significant antenna arrays that are opposite Taiwan within, let's say, 100 nautical miles. It doesn't end there. Navy has their own system, and of course, Air Force does as well. Communications are critical in an amphibious invasion scenario. They're going to want to inject as much chaos as possible, and they're going to want to interrupt communications, whether it's intervening U.S. forces or Taiwan for that matter. Now, this leads now to the strike part of this. This is not a clear graphic, but it gives a sense of the types of long-range precision strike assets that the PLA has. These are just the ballistic missiles and land attack cruise missiles, but give a sense of the range rings. The most recent capability that's probably deployed is the Dongfeng 26, the DF-26 that probably has a range out to about Guam. They have, of course, the DF-21 systems, the DF-16 systems, of a layered approach that they have on strike capabilities. And that's a very important term that I presumably will hear in the next panel, the idea of a layered strike approach. And so with that, let me link it back a little bit to the INF Treaty. When I mentioned before about that command and control system, from a purely military perspective, the battle space is defined as where, on one end, it's the extent of where their strike operations are being conducted or commanded and controlled, all the way to the targets itself. From a purely military perspective, your single point of failure in their overall system is going to be the command and control system. So what's the relevance of the INF Treaty? Well, if you think about if the U.S. was going to have systems that are currently restricted under the INF Treaty, and you look at a China scenario, South China Sea, I'm not sure if it's going to be all that relevant there because there are off-ramps. A Senkaku scenario, maybe, but again, there's off-ramps. It's most relevant in a Taiwan scenario and because of these types of capabilities I described here. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much. We have Dr. Scott Harold next.
All right, if I could, I'm going to present from the seat. So I got to see my own presentation a little more clearly, too. So first off, I'd like to thank Project 2049 for putting this panel together and this entire afternoon together. It's an honor to be sharing the stage with my former graduate school classmate, Ms. Gunnis, and both Rick and Mark, from whom I've learned so much, as well as many in the audience. I'm going to be talking today about the threat to Taiwan and trying to evaluate at a less granular level and a more macroscopic level the PLA threat. And the first thing I want to say is a disclaimer that this is not a RAND presentation. This is not RAND research. This is my own thoughts. So the first point I'd like to make is we're not really dealing with a PLA threat to Taiwan. We're dealing with a People's Republic of China or Chinese Communist Party threat to Taiwan. And the reason I make that point is that the PLA is one tool that China has in its toolkit, among many of which are already deployed against Taiwan. Some of those tools include China's United Front efforts, its efforts to delegitimate Taiwan internationally by creating a narrative that Taiwan always has been and always will be a part of China, and that there's only one China, and that's the People's Republic of China. by creating confusion or a sense of doubt or a lack of commitment within international society to the existence of a legitimate democratic Republic of China or Taiwan, China already starts to win the effort to the contest between China and Taiwan by creating an unlevel playing field. Further, I'd say China is going to compete with Taiwan in the military space across 6 domains. Those are land, sea, air, space, cyberspace, and the electromagnetic spectrum. And China thinks additionally about the human terrain, and there in international society in Taiwan, it looks at using psychological warfare, public opinion warfare, and legal warfare to try to shape minds and put frames or narratives about what is legitimate and what is not at play and in its service. And on the concrete discussion of PLA military capabilities, China has been making pretty substantial strides in recent years in developing its overall military capabilities. In 2014, RAND did a study that looked at weaknesses of the PLA. Since the time of that study's release, we based our analysis on what Chinese analysts themselves wrote and said about the weaknesses of the PLA, and we've seen them making advances in almost every area. But if Taiwan adopts a smart defense strategy, which there is evidence that Taiwan is doing, a nation of 23 million people can resist a very militarily superior power. And we've seen the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan as evidence that the United States military has a difficult time defeating even a smaller capable adversary if it's willing to use lots of different asymmetric means, and some of those asymmetric means are going to be ones that Taiwan can leverage too. So we've talked a little bit about the PRC's strategy here of shaping public narratives. What you see on the right-hand side of this is a shot from Apple, which relabeled Taiwan as Taiwan Province of China. This is something that's happening worldwide with China's effort to try to leverage not only formal diplomatic ties and cut Taiwan off there, but also try to leverage the private sector against Taiwan. This is also a way to attempt to break the will of the Taiwanese. And in the concrete military domain, China is building capabilities that are designed to disincentivize third-party actors from entering this conflict. Those are usually referred to as either counter-intervention capabilities, or as the Pentagon refers to them, or used to refer to them at least, and sometimes still does refer to them, anti-access and area denial capabilities, that being a bubble of threats emanating out from Chinese missile bases, air bases, and from Chinese fielded forces on the surface and subsurface domains. Additionally, the construction of artificial islands in the South China Sea gives an additional vector from which China can attack Taiwan or pose a threat to Taiwan. I think Rick has already pointed out the capability of the PLA to field forces to the west, or I'm sorry, to the east of Taiwan means that Taiwan can no longer merely prepare for a cross-strait attack, but now must be ready to deter and defend against a 360-degree attack. So what are the obstacles to the conquest of Taiwan? Well, I think the first and foremost obstacle is the Taiwan people. And I think this is something that very close military analysis of hardware, capabilities, strategy can easily overlook. Taiwan has enormous reserves of goodwill around the world, but also a very substantial sense of its own identity. And the Taiwan people's will to resist their separate identity is what makes it so difficult for China to play inside Taiwan politics and makes it difficult for China to think about conquering and absorbing Taiwan. The way Rick talks about with the Uyghur community needing to place a PRC national inside every Taiwan family be very, very difficult given the strong sense that people in Taiwan have of attachment to the democracy that they have built over the last 40 years. Additionally, the possibility of third country intervention, most likely the United States, but also conceivably Japan, given that U.S. forces that are based in Asia are largely based in Japan, and therefore China either has to prepare for attacking those forces at the outset, in which case they might bring Japan in, or the possibility that Japan may recognize that if Taiwan goes, then the next threat would be to the Senkakus and to Japan's Southwest Island chain. means that China has to prepare to face not only the 23.5 million people of Taiwan, but also potentially the United States military and the self-defense forces of Japan. Third major obstacle to the conquest of Taiwan is that you need to lift large numbers of forces, and generally speaking, China is not assessed to have the capacity to do that. Now, there are interesting, innovative potential workarounds that Rick has laid out using China's very adaptive and, frankly, insurgent mentality still. They have an insurgent governing mentality from their experience as a revolutionary party or a party that seized political power through conquest using guerrilla tactics, and they still view their own economy and their own civilian component of society as a tool that they can leverage. But you have to do that then using potentially trained forces who are operating inside or alongside of civilians who are not used to combat. That's very disadvantageous to a military. You're then also doing it within range of a series of weapon systems that are explicitly targeted against and prepared against military hardware, but then might be employed against civilian assets like the civilian air fleet, if China is using civilian air fleet, or its civilian maritime capabilities. So that would present a very substantial risk of failure to the PLA. And you're doing it against a military in the ROC armed forces that has been dug in and prepared for the possibility of conflict for 70 years. This is not a pickup game. The ROC is not an incapable adversary that a strike from the blue could catch unawares. The ROC is at all times aware of this threat and is always preparing against it. Additionally, there is an enormous intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance data collection effort that would have to support any PLA attack. It's already been mentioned, but it's important to note that even the United States military, which has always had more ISR collection capability, more data fusion, more experience with disseminating that data for battle targeting and acquisition and then battle damage assessments. Even the U.S. military faces shortfalls in this area, and it's extremely difficult to imagine that China will have all of the intelligence and timely assets and intelligence products it will need to execute this. That's not to say that that's a definite break, but rather it will be a source of degrading of their optimal efficiency in executing any attack. And finally, they don't have any experience with joint combat. This has been one of the main areas of focus of the 2015 onwards defense reforms. It's worth noting, neither did any military on the planet up until the United States military began developing that in the 1990s and 2000s, and Taiwan does not have any experience with joint combat operations in actual wartime. They've certainly been preparing to become more joint. Even other countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, have been working on this problem, and the Taiwanese experience is very helpful through the exercise, the Hanguang exercise, but China has been working on this problem, but it remains an issue. Earlier it was mentioned that at the strategic level and at the political level, the ROC and the PRC will ultimately be led by their commanders, and the commander-in-chief of the Taiwan Armed Forces is President Tsai Ing-wen. Compare her with Xi Jinping. She has a substantially lower threat internally to her rule than in Xi Jinping's case. Because if she's put in a position of challenge, she has the institutional authority of the Taiwan government behind her, whereas Xi Jinping has his guanxi networks and his ability to generate fear. So there's certain challenges when a democracy confronts an autocracy like the PRC. We're talking today a bit about the ROC armed forces, one particular part of that, and that's the ground forces. So looking at the ground forces, the ROC's ground forces will be one of the most valuable tools for dissuading China from attacking, in part because whereas in the air domain or in the maritime domain, those platforms are going to be easily recognizable through their radar returns, through their signatures. A big piece of metal flying against the sky or floating on the water does not have the capacity to enjoy much in the way of cover and concealment, whereas ground forces can enjoy the terrain masking features, the capacity to essentially hide in and amongst the civilian population at certain times. Targeting is much more complicated. So with a very limited number of ports and airfields, Taiwan's air and naval fleets will face somewhat substantially higher challenges. By contrast, the ground forces can disperse potentially in the advance of an attack. Numerous recent studies, including many by RAND, many by the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and others have highlighted the threat that land-based, mobile, anti-ship cruise missiles and anti-surface-to-air missiles mated with dispersed and resilient radar capacities will pose to a PLA invasion fleet and a PLA air fleet that's attempting to attain air superiority or air dominance. And survivability of that fleet is a key feature of a lot of recent research that suggests that Taiwan's defense should really be moving to a survivability, an ability to continue to contest Chinese access for as long as possible. Additionally, RAND has studied the contributions that the reserve forces that Taiwan has, which are a dramatic expansion over and beyond its standard serving ground forces, could provide in helping to deter. PLA writings tend to treat Taiwan's reserves as a very serious obstacle. One of the RAND findings is the Chinese leadership, and I think, Mark, you were probably on that study, if I remember correctly. I think Ian was too.
Yes.
One of the key findings is that while the PLA authors who look at this recognize the challenge that ROC ground force reserves pose, the Chinese leadership does not recognize that. And so leveraging the Taiwan reserves by highlighting their role and employing them more is a key way to deter a conflict from ever breaking out. And then finally, RAND explored many of the weaknesses of the PLA, including in the human domain, where corruption, the command and control architecture, the growing level of lack of physical fitness of PLA soldiers, the morale issues, the issues of it being not a Chinese military, a national military, but a party army, all figure in quite prominently in thinking about how Taiwan's adversary may have some weaknesses that it could exploit. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about areas of concern where we could see the PLA move forward in ways that would be disadvantageous to us and to Taiwan. So here you have Xi Jinping on the left during the 2015 military review. If the PLA was to continue to improve, as they are striving to do so, their ability to operate jointly, their effective command and control structures, if they exercise those more credibly, if they begin to work out some of the kinks in that system, which I think we should expect them to do, they will be getting substantially more capable. Additionally, if they procure and field more airborne or space-based command control systems together with ISR platforms, including UAVs, and as Rick noted, also potentially armed UAVs, that would be an additional problem Taiwan would need to watch out for. As China's surface-to-air missile fleet advances, the ROC Armed Forces air fleet will itself be at greater risk, and China is continuing to build additional air-to-air and air-to-ground strike capabilities that Mark laid out. Additionally, China is going to be building more sea-launched land attack cruise missiles potentially, and that capacity would give it another vector by which to strike Taiwan. Of course, one of the great defenses Taiwan has enjoyed is its ability to lay mines around its ports, around the areas where China might hope to establish a beachhead. If China improves its capacity for mine sweeping, that would be another problem that Taiwan would have to face. How do you relay those mines? How quickly can you relay those mines? And how can you complicate the ability to offload forces onto Taiwan? Strategic as well as tactical lift, as well as sea lift is another area I think Rick talked about a little bit. I won't go too much into that, as well as the rotary wing close air support that China will need if it actually does get onto Taiwan or gets very close to Taiwan. Also, China has not had traditionally large numbers of ship-to-shore connectors or hovercraft that are going to be able to lift many of the forces from the areas proximate to Taiwan's shores onto the actual physical mainland. And then its special operations forces are another area. As we look at the broader efforts that the PLA is nested within, that would be continuing efforts by China to cut off Taiwan diplomatically in the world, to sustain use of private sector companies to delegitimate Taiwan or to send signals to Taiwanese people that ultimately your future can only lie with China. And of course, the use of information operations, infiltration, espionage, and special operations forces So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Those were 3 excellent presentations. We have time. We have about 5 minutes for a round of questions. Okay, so we have 10 minutes for questions. Who's first? Yes, Admiral McDevitt.
Yes. Question for Mark. Your last comment regarding INF treaty or doing away with the INF treaty, how that might apply to the Taiwan scenario. Since air-launched cruise missiles and ship and submarine-launched cruise missiles were exempted from the INF treaty to begin with, presumably the only U.S. cruise missiles that would, or ballistic missiles that would apply would be land-based. And so where did you have in mind land-basing those?
This is on. The quick answer is I haven't gone into that much detail, but as a general principle, I mean, I could see DoD or others, think tanks, are doing a study on what added benefit does one get from ground-launched strike systems. Not just cruise missiles, but there's the old Pershing. In Western Europe, we had the old Pershing II. We had the Glickam, the ground-launched cruise missiles. Pershing II was Army. Glickam was Air Force. What advantage land-based systems would have over air and naval-based systems, I think, is something to be examined. Exactly where it would be, would U.S. Army or Marines, for that matter, or U.S. Air Force benefit from having ground-launched systems in Japan, or Taiwan, for that matter, or Philippines, or wherever? It's something that needs to be looked at, in my view, to see if there's any advantage.
My only thought was
Admiral, I would just add that, in my personal knowledge, there is at least one Asian democratic missile-armed country that is looking to, in response to the American withdrawal from INF, interest the United States in a more generous attitude towards its own missile armament. And to the degree that the United States has discouraged, shall we say, Taiwan from developing long-range ballistic missiles, especially, and space launch capabilities, the end of INF should logically, at least in theory, raise the question about the continuation of the American attitude towards Taiwan's long-range ballistic missile and cruise missile capabilities as well.
INF, but anyway, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Evan Sankey from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Mr. Stokes, you mentioned the role of the strategic rocket forces just briefly. I'm just wondering what, in general, you guys see as the role of nuclear weapons in an invasion scenario. Thank you.
That's a totally different issue. The context I was describing these are including INF, are conventional only. Now, there is a crossover. There's also addressing Admiral McDevitt's some comments. There is a crossover with the nuclear domain. In a peacetime situation, the rocket forces, PLA rocket force brigades that are deployed in Southeast China opposite Taiwan, there's some that are dedicated to conventional operations, and then maybe 2 that are dedicated to nuclear operations. Theoretically, a ballistic missile is a ballistic missile, and it can deliver. It doesn't care what its tip, what's on the tip. But normally, you're going to have a brigade that's trained and equipped for either nuclear or conventional operations. The command and control part of this that I mentioned before. I am not aware of any intent, and I haven't seen any reflection of any intent to of those nuclear capable forces within their rocket forces, of them being chopped or them being assigned to a theater commander. My understanding, these would be purely nationally level controlled assets. So they may share, the nuclear conventional brigades, they may share some infrastructure, some communications, but normally you're going to see conventional, like the command center I mentioned that was put up there, normally you're going to see it being directive of conventional forces. So the context here is primarily conventional. There is a nuclear element, but that's a whole totally different story.
I would add that in 2012, a retired former deputy commander of the Russian rocket force published a very useful report in which he, apparently based on Russian intelligence sources, wrote that the PLA has about 500 tactical nuclear weapons spread between the rocket force and airdrop bombs.
What else? Yes.
Hello, Patrick Savage with the Institute for Defense Analysis. I know Mr. Fisher touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering what you see the role potentially being of PLA airborne forces in an invasion scenario. I know we've heard a lot about amphibious capabilities. Do you think the air defense situation would just be too hostile for airborne forces? Or do you think the PLA would be able to effectively suppress that and use airborne forces to a greater extent?
The way for special forces and airborne forces would likely be well prepared by sleeper forces. Again, surprise would be of the essence. But I fully expect that, yes, airborne special op will be fully integrated into an overall invasion campaign.
Rachel Burton with the Project 2049 Institute. I wanted to go back to Rick Fisher, your comments about the PLA Marines and the mechanization of their Marines and their special forces. Could you talk a little bit about what you see PLA Marines or their special forces, what you see them doing in an invasion scenario?
One of the results of the 2015 reorganization and reforms has been to vastly increase the size of the Marine Corps and make it into a much more of a global power projection tool, similar, but even from the get-go, much more heavily armed than the American Marine Corps. What we're seeing in some cases is the transfer of some Army newly wheeled mechanized units directly into the Marine Corps, but there will also be a lot of room for building up new units. Informal Chinese sources suggest the Marine Corps will be expanded to about 100,000, seven plus brigades, maybe more. But the clear emphasis very early on of not just, of building on the recently completed reequipment of the amphibious assault arms with new units designed to exploit whatever beachhead is secured very quickly and go on the offensive is a very significant development for the PLA, for the Marines, and for the ground forces. That I assume will retain some amphibious assault units, but in addition, the medium weight mechanized kit is far easier to transport. It does not stress all of the large ferries that have been built specifically to also be able to carry out military transport missions, and all of the much smaller, lighter river barges that exist probably in the thousands will have a much easier time carrying medium weight armor versus the heavyweight, and they'll still be effective. Precision guided rounds in the bigger tank and artillery rounds, and AAA support capabilities will all follow the assault capabilities.
Okay, Scott gets the last word. We're out of time.
Maybe to, again, point out that on Halloween, there are oftentimes things that seem really scary, but then at the end, the bad guys always lose and the good guys always win. That's not the real world, obviously, but it is often the case. So when I hear Rick, if I understood you correctly, say that the PLA Marines are going to be better or heavier armed or have more capabilities than the U.S. Marine Corps, when they've gone from, I think, 10,000 to maybe 30,000, or one leaked document says 100,000, and I think the U.S. Marine Corps has amphibious assault ships that most countries would covet as their best aircraft carrier. The U.S. Marine Corps has F-35Bs. U.S. Marine Corps has 100 and God knows, 200, 300, how many thousands of years of experience do we have in the Marine Corps? General Gregson, you can tell us. I just wonder if you could unpack that a little more, because I think it'd be damaging to leave today with the impression that the PLA Marine Corps is suddenly better than the U.S. Marine Corps, and I'm sure that wasn't the message you wanted to convey, but it was certainly what it sounded like to me, and I don't think that's what you mean, right?
You have a minute, because then we have to end. Sorry.
Okay, well, we should pick this up on every Halloween and revisit it. Well, Scott, yes, we tried to develop a fast amphibious assault vehicle. We decided that it wouldn't work, canceled. The PLA reduced the requirements by half. That vehicle works for the most part, and it wins almost by default, because there's nothing else in the world like the ZBD-05 family. So 105 got precision-guided weapons from the get-go, troop carrying, logistic support comes straight to the shore. The American wheeled amphibious, marine wheeled amphibious is slow. If it's going to get to the shore fast, it relies on a limited number of hovercraft. And the Marine Corps' tanks, impressive, yes, M1 tanks, again, rely on the hovercraft. The Air Force, no. The PLA Marines don't have their Air Force yet, but the LHDs are on the way. And I recall a conversation with a very highly ranked designer in the Chengdu Aircraft Corporation back in 2005, when I had the chance to corner him at a conference table, and asked him about possible VSTOL medium weight 5th generation fighter programs, and he said, well, at the time we were thinking about starting an F-35 like program, which implies STOVL as well. Apparently, they've learned a lot from the Yak, Russian Yak Corporation, about STOVL aircraft, and the commentariat, PLA web commentariat, is full of speculation, at least. But I do have one solid footnote of real interest in giving the Marines and Air Force as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panelists for excellent presentations, and go on to the next panel.
If we're playing war.
Before we start the second panel, I just wanted to apologize about the heat. We are aware of it, and we've been told they're doing everything they can to try and cool down the room. So our apologies. We have provided some water in the back behind that wall. If you do need a cup of water, please feel free. And then come right back because we're going to start our second panel.
Playing board game war, real troops.
I'll do the panel. The coveted right-hand seat. All right, I have to squeeze my knees.
You guys need a room expander. How far back can we go before we dive off the edge?
We'll see. They're out of life. There's some water here as well. Okay, thank you everyone. We're here for our last panel of the day. I know the first panel, again, was a sobering, and if you feel like it was very sobering, there's a pick-me-up in the back of the room. But our job really here on the second panel, Taiwan's response, is to hopefully uplift the room just a little bit. First, actually, it's hard to have a conference called the PLA Invasion Threat and Taiwan's Response without Project 2049's research fellow Ian Easton, who literally wrote the book on it, The Chinese Invasion Threat, Taiwan's Defense and American Strategy in Asia. So just as a shout out to him, since he could not be here, he's having lots of fun in the UK at the moment, attending a conference. But I highly recommend people reading the book if you're interested in any of these topics. It's available on Amazon, also as an ebook, and we also have a few paperback copies here for sale with cash, if anyone still carries that around these days. And so on the first panel, we talked a lot about PLA capabilities, PLA strike capabilities, mobile rocket artillery, PLA Marines, that we talked about, amphibious units, increase in inland projection capabilities, increase in precision-guided missiles, and having a panel that kind of packs together PLA capabilities like that in 1 hour, the question automatically is, well, how do we recover from that? And as I mentioned, and hopefully this panel will try and help us recover from that hour. So this panel is really going to work to address Taiwan's response, which will require great and steady leadership from Taiwan's elected officials and their military officers, great courage and resiliency from the Taiwan people, And last but not least, the lethal fighting force of Taiwan's ground forces, Navy, and Air Force. In an interest of time, I'm not going to go through the esteemed panel, esteemed bios of my fellow panelists up here whose own reputations precedes themselves. So thank you so much for joining us, and great admiration and respect. I'm just not going to read your bios. So if I can, we're going to kick this off with Jim Thomas. So I will hand the microphone over to you.
Great, thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to Mark and Ian and Rachel and your colleagues for organizing today's event and inviting me to take part. The topic I was given was to talk about lessons Taiwan's Army might take from the U.S. Army, which is kind of an interesting, it's an interesting prompt. And certainly there's a lot that both armies can learn from one another, especially in terms of some key technologies, and I'm going to come back and circle back to that at the end. But I thought what I'd do is start off by talking a little bit about comparing and contrasting Taiwan's Army with the U.S. Army in terms of their strategic predicaments and what they're trying to accomplish, and then talk about the joint context for Taiwan and how the Army nests itself in a joint context, and then touch on some of the critical Army missions and posture characteristics that are needed, and then kind of close out talking about perhaps some investment choices that Taiwan might consider. So as I went into this and was thinking about Taiwan's Army and the U.S. Army, it really dawned on me, you've got to be really careful not to draw the wrong lessons. And I think that there's a real danger in U.S. force planning globally, and this really comes out of the Cold War, that we really expected our allies to be, in an Austin Powers context, kind of mini-me's, that they would be scaled-down versions of ourselves. It was a scaled-down Air Force, a scaled-down Navy, a scaled-down Army, but the characteristics would be much the same. And that makes sense if you're kind of a global superpower and you're thinking about deployments halfway around the world, because the U.S. Army remains the world's greatest expeditionary combined arms maneuver force. But we've been really focused on counterinsurgency operations and forward defense in the NATO area particularly. The basic schemata in the minds of most U.S. military officers is that we're going to deploy as an expeditionary joint force, and then the land component is going to maneuver to contact, and it's going to close and destroy an opposing army. And the more I think about it, that's exactly what we're probably not expecting Taiwan's Army to do. There's also a really heavy emphasis in U.S. Army doctrine on armored maneuver, and especially when you think about other branches like artillery, we subordinate our artillery to supporting the land maneuver force. We don't have anything like a second artillery corps or a strategic rocket force that thinks about the use of artillery independent of the maneuver force. So all of this is then to say, well, what would be the characteristics for Taiwan's Army that would make sense? And Samuel Huntington wrote an article 60 years or so ago talking about the U.S. Navy and what its purpose was or what its mission should be. And he said fundamentally it's what the American people want it to do. And I would say here, what are the missions that Taiwan's Army needs to do? It's fundamentally what the missions that the people of Taiwan want it to do. And that trumps anything that an ally like the United States or anyone else might want from Taiwan. Fundamentally, it's going to be about the defense of Taiwan. There's no need for an expeditionary force. And I think this is a really important point, especially given where we are in our debate about the U.S. Army right now and thinking about exiting the Inf Treaty and thinking about longer range fires. I think it's the exact opposite for Taiwan. The more I was thinking about this coming over here, is the United States is heading in the direction of longer and longer range fires out beyond 500 kilometers. I think Taiwan's headed in exactly the opposite direction, which is thinking about sacrificing range for a greater mass. And I think that really is the key for thinking about the future of Taiwan's land force. So my second point has to do with the joint context. And in the United States, there's a fantastic fantastic professor at the U.S. Army's School of Advanced Military Studies, Rick Senrich, who once said, any day the U.S. Army and an infantryman goes into combat and doesn't have air superiority is a terrible day. That we expect we're going to fight as a joint force, and that we have air and naval, marine air forces that are going to clear the skies and keep our land forces safe. That's exactly what Taiwan's army is not going to have. If you're really thinking about a worst case scenario, such as an invasion, Taiwan's combat aircraft are either going to be destroyed on the ground, or they'll be destroyed shortly after they take to the air in very short order. But they're extremely vulnerable to attack, both from surface-to-surface missiles as well as long-range SAMs once they're in the air. Naval combatants, surface combatants, are not going to be much better off. They will really get dispatched very quickly. Even new designs with higher speed vessels and catamarans and all the like, it's only a matter of time. But they're not forces that are really designed for protraction. They also happen to be super expensive. And I think that this has to enter into kind of the force planning debate that's going on in Taiwan today in terms of reallocating resources across the various services. The Army is fundamentally the last line of defense for Taiwan. Ultimately, in the worst case scenario, the Army is all Taiwan's going to have until third-party intervention. So it has to be highly survivable, it has to have greater mass effects, and it has to be able to impose conditions of protraction. There may not be any fighting alongside air and naval forces. There may not be any joint force. And so I think this really should have a huge impact in thinking about force planning prioritization. So that brings me to my third point, which is thinking about what are the critical Army missions and posture for Taiwan. Into the future, just as it's been in the past, countering an amphibious assault will continue to be a major mission, perhaps the major mission. But I would also say that there are a number of other scenarios besides this worst case scenario that this conference is looking at that probably need to be elevated in priority for force planning in Taiwan. Thinking about close blockade, thinking about a coercive missile strike campaign, thinking about decapitation campaigns. So I think expanding the spectrum of scenarios for thinking about future force planning for Taiwan is going to be really important. What I would propose, though, is that beyond just the missions, maybe it's thinking about how to essentially judo throw hostile doctrine. There's a lot of emphasis on the three dominances that an adversary force might try to achieve: information dominance, followed by air dominance, followed by maritime dominance. Figuring out how you deprive your adversary of those dominances, I think, not only enhances deterrence, but also improves the war fighting probability of success for Taiwan. And here, I think Taiwan's army, unlike the U.S. Army, which focuses more symmetrically on closing and defeating a foreign army, can focus more on the defeat of enemy naval and air forces. That these cross-domain denial activities factor much more heavily. And you have this yin and yang of both ground-launched anti-air as well as anti-ship operations that have to take place. In all of this, I would say that the posture for Taiwan's army really needs to be one that's much more unconventional and much more guerrilla-like. It's an air defense posture that looks more like, it's more akin to North Vietnam's in the late 60s and early 70s. And coupled with massed fires that are more analogous to North Korea's on the Quezon Heights. That looks pretty attractive to me in terms of something I wouldn't want to go up against. And the suppression problems that would pose are pretty significant. But I'd say that an important corollary of this is, as much as you're trying to deny your adversary information dominance and you're trying to jam their comms and jam their Baidu signals and other things, you're also trying to minimize your own reliance on robust C4ISR. And this, in my mind, is really coming to the fore, which is how do you essentially make the Taiwan army much less sensitive to interruptions in C4ISR? And in particular, how do you reduce dependencies on off-board sensors and place far greater emphasis on fire and forget weapons? So this brings me to my last point, which is just thinking about some key investment choices for Taiwan looking ahead. I wrote a paper with some colleagues at CSBA about 4 years ago called Hard Rock 2.0. One of our big things in there was really emphasizing anti-ship missiles like HF-2 and HF-3, as well as medium-range SAMs, kind of the class of, and for the U.S., something like an enhanced Sea Sparrow. The more I think about it, I think the medium-range SAM that's out about 25 nautical miles, I think still is about right. But I would say you need something to complement the HF-2s and 3s. And what some of my colleagues at Telemus Group and I've been playing around with is essentially thinking much more about guided artillery rounds. Taiwan's already moving in this direction, but there's an opportunity. The Navy has been playing around with an incremental version of the Excalibur artillery round, where it would actually, it has a little more range, and it would have a millimeter wave terminal seeker on it. So it's a fire and forget weapon. It seems to me like we need a land ground launch system that's like that. Looks like these are about, according, just on the back of an envelope, probably be about $100,000 each for the round. So it sounds like a lot of money for a round, but when you think about one shot, one kill, you get 10,000 rounds for about $1 billion, and you throw on about 150 M777 ultralight towed howitzers for another billion. For $2 billion, you have a wicked hard problem in terms of suppression. This is good, especially for anti-ship and imposing an amphibious assault. What this does essentially is, in addition to essentially distributed truck-launched air denial capabilities out to about 25 nautical miles, this essentially creates something kind of like Kim Jong-un's Sea of Fire at about 20 nautical miles out. And here you can rely on hardened artillery sites and bunkers and shoot and scoot and then come back and reload. But that's a pretty tough problem to deal with. And my last point would really be, I think there's got to be a massive reallocation of resources and a massive shift from Taiwan's Air Force and Navy towards its Army. That we should expect the Taiwan people and the United States as a security partner really should expect an imbalanced force, because that's really what Taiwan needs. The days of trying to have a balanced joint force that looks like a balanced U.S. joint force, I think those days are over. I'll close there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. If I were to read your bio, mentioning Hard Rock 2.0 would have been a part of it, and I know you have a specific chapter that's focused on layered ground defense, where you talk a lot about the points that you brought up in your presentation. So thank you. We're going to move on to General Gregson.
Oh, good afternoon, and thanks to Project 2049 for doing this. That, in addition to the U.S. Taiwan Business Council meeting yesterday, this has become Taiwan Week. When talking about military things, it's always a great temptation for retired military folks to dive right down into specific details, complete with jargon and acronyms, and we often confuse more than we clarify. So let me try to do it in a different way and talk about how to think about Taiwan's defense today, and specifically the capabilities of Taiwan's ground forces. And here's a preview. The most important piece of gear or kit or equipment might be something that doesn't make any noise at all above a low hum. Let's accept, going from top down, that Taiwan's security is a fundamental objective of the government, and that to be able to deter China from attempting forcible annexation is necessary. Successful deterrence in Taiwan's situation requires an undoubted ability to prevent quick Chinese success. And to do that, Taiwan maintains armed forces and a Ministry of Defense to manage its affairs. The fundamental element, echoing the article you cited, of a service is its purpose or role in implementing national policy, its strategic concept. This concept describes how, when, and where the military force expects to protect the nation against some threat to its security. A second element of a military service is the resources, human and materiel, needed to implement the strategic concept. To secure these resources, it is necessary for society to forego the alternative uses to which these resources might be put and agree to allocate them to the military. Thus, the resources a service gains in a democratic society depend on public support, which depends on the public's understanding of the viability of the service's role, its strategic concept. Organizational structure is a third element of a military service. The structure must efficiently use the resources to implement its strategic concept. The organizational structure of the service must support the strategic concept. There's no ideal or permanent structure. It must change as national policy, threats, technology, especially lately, and resources available change. If strategic concepts and organizational structure can't or won't change, the service becomes irrelevant to the needs of the nation and the risk of national calamity rises. It's up to Taiwan, of course, to do the rigorous, continuous analysis that supports the development of these strategic concepts. Likewise, it's up to Taiwan to structure its armed forces, particularly the ground forces, so that the resources can efficiently be applied to the defense of Taiwan. We can't do all that analysis today, but we can suggest some obvious factors to consider. Geography is obvious, specifically the 110 miles that separate Taipei from the mainland, and the fact that Taiwan sits at the intersection of the East and the South China Seas. Powerful surveillance and weapons accurate at distance are another. The image you can get on your iPhone while I'm talking from Google is way beyond what used to be classified material years ago. So if you can be found, you can be targeted. If you can be targeted, you can be hit. The numerical odds facing Taiwan are daunting, but technology brings new opportunities to the defense, specifically cooperative engagement across all four services. The fires and effects from land, sea, and air can and must be integrated in real time. Doesn't matter, each platform can be a detection means, each platform can be a firing means. You can keep airplanes relatively safe by using their radars to detect targets and fire on them from something else, and this is specifically applicable to the ground forces. Any sequential or symmetric engagement will not be successful because of the numerical odds. Another emerging advantage is the ability to defeat cruise and ballistic missiles in a very cost-effective manner, where finally our bullet to defeat an inbound missile costs less than the target. Much has been made of China's ability to bombard Taiwan with impunity. In the Cold War, we used to differentiate between counter-value capabilities or targeting and counter-force targeting. There's no guarantee that China is going to limit itself to counter-force targeting, which means the population will be a target in Taiwan, which means that to be viable, the military's got to provide some protection to the Taiwan population against these missile attacks. A cooperative engagement concept with the right detectors and the right shooters can offer a good opportunity to synchronize the defense on this in achieving perhaps boost phase intercept over China. If that's impractical, we can achieve near ascent phase intercept when the missile is at its most vulnerable, rather than waiting to catch it with a big catcher's mitt on the way down. Mobile ground forces can also provide decisive fires to support naval and air forces in the fight to deny China sea and air control across the strait and beyond the east coast of Taiwan. No longer should ground forces limit themselves to being interested spectators in the fight for air and sea control. Ground forces must be fully engaged from the beginning with weapons that can reach out at relevant distances, beyond 110 miles for starters, to support the fight in the air and at sea. Enemy forces at sea and in the air must find themselves under attack from many platforms from all domains, air, land, sea, space, cyberspace, and EW, simultaneously. No battle goes strictly according to plan. Even the best planned, equipped, and integrated air, land, sea, space, cyber defense it's likely that the PRC will achieve a foothold of some sort somewhere on the main island and on some of the offshore islands. At that point, the maneuverability of Taiwan's ground forces, fully supported and integrated with Taiwan's air and sea forces, to locate, close with, and destroy enemy forces by fire and close combat wherever they may be found will be essential. The ground forces must be exceptionally proficient at defensive and offensive combat in urban areas and in the close terrain of inundated fields and in the mountains. In its simplest representation, Taiwan needs the ability to integrate the efforts of all four services in real time, the surveillance necessary to target the enemy, and many small, smart, and effective weapons that can engage at distance. Thank you.
Thank you, General. At the very end there, I think the integration of all the forces struck me. I think I recall it was a year and a half ago when Admiral Harris, who was then PACOM commander, made the announcement that there was a need or an expectation that perhaps the Army should be able to be capable to hit and target ships. Is that what you're referring to?
Enemy ships and airplanes must find themselves under attack from all domains simultaneously. Airplanes are wonderful things. While they're aloft, they require fuel, they require ammunition. Eventually, even if successful, they got to return to base to reload ammunition. Ships are similarly situated. Airplanes and ships reveal themselves when they fire, and they become detectable. On the other hand, you've got ground forces which are sitting on top of the greatest fortification material in the world, Earth, and they can be widely dispersed, they can be mobile to avoid Chinese targeting, and they can shoot and move. One of the best uses, in my opinion, of Taiwan's aerial platforms and perhaps even seaborne platforms is the detection of targets and the instantaneous relay of target quality data to a firing unit, which can very often be ground forces situated somewhere with proper weapons that can reach out at distance with terminal guidance, millimeter wave, something to put on weapons where we can actually shoot the bullet and it's affordable instead of what we're trapped into now. But yes, I'm not quite as ready as my colleague to write off the viability of ships and airplanes yet, but I think that intelligent use of this can enhance their survivability and their effectiveness. Terms like integrate, terms like simultaneous engagement really aren't strong enough. What we're talking about is one single battle where airplanes, ships, and missiles and other devices and drones are all operating in the same space and hitting the enemy and not hitting each other. And this is achievable in the with the way technology is going.
Thank you. I had a thought and it just floated away from me. So I'm going to move on. Hopefully it comes back to me later and we'll have some more time for Q&A at the end. I'm going to move on down to David On. So take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Rachel. So we're talking today about nightmare scenarios. War itself, any war is worse than any nightmare, any war, because with a nightmare, you wake up and everything's fine. So when I considered the nightmare scenario with Taiwan, I looked back into history and I found a true nightmare scenario deep in history. I bring you back to 400 BC, to the island of Melos as it tries to defend against naval powerhouse Athens while hoping that Sparta will come defend it in time. The ending is a terrible nightmare. It's about the past. I'm not saying anything about the future, but there are a few parallels to Taiwan here. There's some questions that we're dealing with today. Is it not right or just with our norms today to attack someone else for little reason than conquest, since we're past the age of empire, we're past colonies? How important is it for Taiwan to have as strong as military as possible, considering the trade-offs with government spending and social services? Would the adversary be constrained by avoiding this negative international image for being aggressive? Would that be enough to prevent attack? Should Taiwan just give up without fighting in the beginning rather than face a harsher result by resisting at the end? Would the U.S. come to Taiwan's aid in an attack? If the U.S. doesn't come to Taiwan's aid, will it call into question the U.S. alliance structure in the entire region? Therefore, it must come to Taiwan's aid? Would others like Japan come to Taiwan's aid? And what if nobody comes to Taiwan's aid? Again, this is the past. I'm not saying the future is not predetermined. I bring you to chapter 17 of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. The Athenians, he lays it out, he says, the Athenians made an expedition against the Isle of Melos with 30 ships on their own, 1,500 heavy infantries. The Melians are a colony of Sparta that would not submit to the Athenians like the other islanders, and first remained neutral and took no part in the struggle. So they have a dialogue before to try to prevent war. The Melians said, we can reasonably expect from this negotiation, we expect war. If we prove we have right on our side and we refuse to submit, in the contrary case, they expect slavery. The Athenians, who are stronger, responded, you know as well as we do that right as the world goes is only in question between equals of power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That famous phrase in realism. They continued, we would exercise that empire over you without trouble and see you preserved for the good of us both. And Melian said, how, pray, can it turn out to be as good for us to serve as for you to rule? And Athenians said, because you would have the advantage of submitting before suffering the worst, and we shall gain by not destroying you. And I'm going to spare you of the details. I encourage you to keep looking at its fascinating interaction. Melians continue to say that they are right and they are just against the unjust, that Sparta is going to come to their defense, that Athens' aggression will make other neutrals into their enemies. And at the very end, Melians closed, and they came to a decision. They said, quote, our resolution, Athenians, is the same as it was at first. We will not in a moment deprive of freedom a city that has been inhabited these 700 years. We will put our trust in the fortune by which the gods have preserved it until now, and the help of men, that is the Spartans. So we will try and save ourselves. Meanwhile, we invite you to allow us to be friends to you and foes of neither party, and to retire from our country after making such a treaty as seem fit to us both. And the Athenians responded, well, you alone, as it seems to us, judging from these resolutions, regard what is future as more certain than what is before your own eyes. And what is out of sight in your eagerness is already coming to pass, and you will have staked most on and trusted most in the Spartans, your future, your hopes, and you will be most completely deceived. The Athenian envoys returned to the army, Melians showing no signs of yielding. Generals betook themselves to hostilities, drew a line of circumvention around the Melians. Summer was now over. Next winter, the Spartans intended to invade the Argive territory. Around the same time, Melians took another part of the Athenian lines that were feebly garrisoned. Reinforcements arrived from Athens to Melos under the command of Philocrates, son of Demeas. The siege against Melos was now pressed vigorously, and we get to the nightmare scenario. The Melians surrendered at the discretion of the Athenians, who put to death all the grown men whom they took and sold the women and children for slaves, and subsequently sent out 500 colonists and inhabited the place themselves. So that, I bring this up because it's a nightmare scenario. And it's one of the worst nightmare scenarios that I could think of. And we're here talking about these nightmare scenarios because we hope to work together to prevent this from happening, to hope for the best, but plan for the worst. So today, for the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on what Taiwan is doing during peacetime to respond to and prepare for this kind of nightmare scenario. And the organizers, Rachel and others, specifically asked me to discuss Taiwan's indigenous defense industry with a focus on its ground forces. Because over our think tank, Global Taiwan Institute, a few months ago, we released a report on Taiwan's indigenous defense industry. 25 pages, available on our website, free PDF download. For the other side, for what Taiwan would do during wartime, the other panelists are already talking about it. We mentioned Ian Easton's book about the China invasion threat. There are practitioners in the room, military officers, so I defer to them. So first off, I'm impressed by Taiwan. I'm impressed by Taiwan's indigenous defense industry to produce platforms like the Clouded Leopard APV, armored personnel vehicle, and indigenous assault rifles. I'm impressed by Taiwan's equipment inventory with arms sales purchases from U.S. arms sales to Taiwan as U.S. support for Taiwan. And I'm very impressed with Taiwan's international diplomatic and military engagement that's growing over time. So what we found when we look at Taiwan's ground forces in our report is we found that the production of Taiwan's weapons platforms and components follows this top-heavy state-run model. As with the rest of Taiwan's defense industry, primary research and development and systems management for Taiwan Army's arms production is a function of NCSIST, National Chongshan Institute for Science and Technology. NCSIST produces a combination of U.S. licensed small arms and armored vehicles, modified small arms platforms based on U.S. designs, indigenous weapons and armor systems. It also manufactures platforms on its own, such as a Thunderbolt 2000 multiple rocket launch system designed to target disembarking amphibious troops. We found that for Taiwan's small arms and ammunition indigenous capabilities, that the 205 arsenal in Kaohsiung provides a manufacturing service for Taiwan's small arms and munitions production. It also designs and develops indigenously produced small arms like the XT-105 assault rifle, T-65, and then T-91 rifle. So Taiwan also supplied NATO standard rifle ammunition to the United States in 2005 during the U.S. war in Iraq, and exports ammunition to civilian markets like the U.S. commercial market to stores under the Wolf brand of ammunition. And on armored personnel vehicles, Taiwan's Ordnance Readiness Development Center, located in Nantou County, is responsible for the development and production of Taiwan's armored vehicles, including the new family of CM-32 Clouded Leopard armored vehicles. The CM-32 was designed with the varied terrain of Taiwan in mind. So in addition to being impressed, though, I also, based on personal experience, have some suggestions for Taiwan. My suggestions are hardening, secrecy, and training. So in my visits over to Taiwan, I've been to Air Force bases, and even from the outside road where buses can pass by and tourists can see, you're seeing fighter aircraft that are in these bunkers, maybe 2 feet concrete covered with dirt. That would look like it was built maybe 2 or 3, 4 decades ago. Today, with precision strike equipment, with missile systems, that's going to be, that's not going to be as fortified as it should be. And if we're talking about fighter aircraft, say an F-16, that's a $50 million asset. So number one is hardening. Secrecy, there's a lot on the open source about where Taiwan places its tunnels to hide the aircraft. So I hope that, because we don't know what we don't know, I hope that there's a lot that we don't know out there where Taiwan has these facilities that are very secret, but there's really a lot of it revealed in the open source from enthusiasts or looking at the satellite imagery. So that, to me, is concerning. But the whole direction, for the U.S. government recommendations for Taiwan is actually moving away from these large infrastructure and large platforms towards small, agile, and dispersed in general to deal with this. And training, to be creative in training, to train for various worst-case nightmare scenarios, just to brainstorm, 1,000 micro UAVs are coming across the strait, missiles barrage coming out of nowhere because they're submarine launched, troops that are entering Taiwan, but you don't know they're there, they're embedded because they came in through tourism channels, and then they had smuggled arms or airdropped at the last moment. Things that you don't really expect. Things are just brainstorming some creative scenarios, perhaps to hire Taiwan companies or even U.S. defense contractors to help Taiwan during exercises or training to surprise them. So as the U.S. government often says, DoD often says to its partners and allies, to train the way you fight, to not be scripted. So in closing, I'm going to bring us back and say that, I see that we're all working toward avoiding this kind of semblance of the Malian dialogue. The Melos was faced with this tough decision to live as slaves or to die as free people. So ultimately, though, if Taiwan is presented with some kind of stark choice to voluntarily unify or to fight, it would be a decision of the Taiwan government and of the Taiwan people. I would respect that decision, and I suppose that we would too. However, I want to warn from a key point in international relations theory, and a key point in realism and IR theory is, quote unquote, that there is a lack of supranational authority to enforce agreements. What that means is that there's no world government, for better or worse, because if there was, whose government? China's? US? But because that's the fact right now in the world, there's no world government, so therefore, if another side promises, makes it sound really rosy, there's no actually, they could do the opposite of what they said. So at the onset, lay down your guns, lose your political self-determination, let our troops in. Everything can sound good at the beginning, but because of this IR key point, it's important to keep in mind of the lack of supranational authority. So in the meantime, I'm impressed with what Taiwan's doing to improve its military, as I've outlined, improve the U.S. Taiwan security cooperation and military relationship, and to bring about peace and stability in the East Asia region. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And your comments actually reminded me of the question I had for you, General, but perhaps one that all of you could think about is just about the training aspects of all of this. One, how much time would that take, and what does Taiwan's ground forces need to do to be able to start having a more integrated defense or a more layered defense, and something for you all to think about a little bit as we move over to Fume. And I hope you can talk a little bit about Taiwan's overall defense concept, your thoughts, your feelings about it. For those who don't know, Taiwan is rolling out this new defense concept. I don't think that's exactly what you're going to be talking about, but later on, I'd be interested to hear your comments.
For those of you that
Press that button.
For those of you that missed my presentation at the U.S. Taiwan Defense Industry Conference, I'll try to do a little bit of a.
In 10 minutes, so audience can actually ask a question.
But the good thing about going last is that you could actually try to play off the wisdom that's been introduced first by earlier speakers, including Dr. Harrell, General Gregson, and of course Mr. Thomas. In fact, they cover sort of like at different ends of the spectrum with respect to asymmetric defense strategy with respect to Taiwan. In the last decade of just talking to and working with the Taiwanese military with respect to asymmetry, or asymmetric and innovative defense strategies, as the U.S. DoD had belabored to proselytize to Taiwan. I've learned several things about how the Taiwanese military thinks about this, and that is number one. Asymmetry strategy by itself, it cannot work by itself, nor could it become the entirety of Taiwan's defense posture. Not least because neither the Taiwanese military nor the political leadership would accept it. We won't get into that today, but I think some of the reasons are pretty obvious. Nevertheless, asymmetrical operational concepts like the so-called overall defense concept that's recently been rolled out in the last year can be quite viable in significantly reducing the enemy's ability to achieve the desired military and political objectives, especially when they're combined with select attack capabilities that can be used to neutralize critical, high-demand, low-density assets. And these could be things that range from critical C4ISR platforms to something as mundane as mine countermeasure vessels. And these HDLD assets will be essential to PLA's successful prosecution of a high-intensity, high-tempo operations campaign. And I think that's where the value, and Taiwan is starting to see that, even though there's still a lot of parochial biases that mitigate against it. All right, so, and ODC, I'm gonna start referring to this jargon now, overall defense concept, or let's just call it asymmetrical strategy, offers an affordable solution that could complement Taiwan's more traditional defense capabilities and force structure. And it's important to emphasize if U.S. or those of us that care about Taiwan want to see Taiwan adopt greater, more asymmetrical approach, it is important that we underscore that it is not an either or, right? That, oh, no, it's gonna be all asymmetrical now and no F-16s or no submarines. Believe me, then ODC would die instantly, okay? So therefore, it is very important to acknowledge that it is not, to use the Chinese proverbial expression, it's not a choice between the bear paw and the fish, right? It's actually a bear paw and fish stew. The challenge is how to get the recipe right. How much bear paw, how much fish, right? Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind because that's very important politically. Okay? Not to mention, it also makes sense militarily. And most importantly, it's not just a matter of cost. There's also the cost dimension because there is the fear. A lot of the people who in the military and in the Taiwan national security sphere, they are resistant to ODC or asymmetrical strategies because their concern is that, this is going to suck up all the resources that would then otherwise not be available for other capabilities or more traditional capabilities, which could afford Taiwan a bigger strategic role in the region. Okay? Also undertake other more complex operational missions, like ASW, keeping their economic lifeline, maritime trade open, which ODC won't be able to handle. All right? It's not even that, because the cost of any one of these major conventional programs, like a submarine program, new destroyers, or a wing of new fighters, would easily exceed all of the prescriptions of an asymmetrical strategy like ODC. So to say that we don't want to adopt ODC or asymmetry on cost grounds because it would otherwise wipe out all of our, that is simply not true. Also, ODC or asymmetry has the further advantage of being able to be implemented over a relatively short period of time. They can be done over several years, in addition to being able to be done in relatively, I wouldn't say low, but reasonable cost levels, okay? And therefore, it could provide a viable stopgap that could complicate Beijing's war planning and help deter Chinese military aventurism in the near term. Indeed, Taiwan's defense white paper, which was published just last month, acknowledged that China could be ready for a major campaign against Taiwan by as early as 2020. So while things like submarines and destroyers and F-35Bs will be nice, and in fact, one could argue that they're necessary, and they could offer very powerful new warfighting capabilities, but they wouldn't be ready in time, okay, for a nightmare scenario, say by 2020 or 2022, when Xi Jinping has certain things to answer for internally, or even 2025. So therefore, Taiwan needs to buy time to build up additional capabilities. And at this point in time, the only feasible vehicle that will allow it to do so is through an asymmetrical approach like ODC. Now, possibly with some addendums and modifications, all of which the U.S. should and can support and assist. Now, understandably, Taiwan continues to want to place priority in maintaining some minimum degree of air operations capability even after the war has started. Because even temporary control of very limited airspace will be highly valuable to the conduct of fighting the anti-invasion war. Everything from anti-ship, anti-landing, close air support, or mine warfare, or mine countermeasures warfare would depend on some level of air operation. Okay? For this reason, Taiwan has taken steps to maximize survivability of a relatively small number of key air bases. Instead of trying to defend all 12 air bases, they've now identified a small number of air bases, and they're moving things like PAC-3 batteries. Okay, they're redeploying them to increase TBMD coverage. They're planning to deploy CWIS or closing weapon systems and short-range air defense systems at critical facilities to defend against land attack cruise missiles. They're deploying the GPS or BeiDou satellite navigation jammers around major critical facilities to degrade, systems that are guided by satellite navigation. There's physical hardening, of course, and as Admiral Chen had alluded to earlier, RRR, rapid runway repair capabilities, which Taiwan has built up a very robust capability for over the past decade. So these are things that Taiwan is already starting to do, okay, to help. These are, one could characterize them as asymmetrical, okay, to keep the so-called vulnerable air and sometimes naval capabilities to at least preserve some of that force even after the war has started. An example in the asymmetrical in the naval area, asymmetrical example in the naval area, so enhance survivability through distributed naval combat firepower. The plans to the new stealthy and shallow draft for some 100-ton vessel. These catamaran corvettes have very shallow draft, and they can operate in Category 1 fishing ports. The plans to introduce and develop 45-ton stealthy fast attack boats with HF-2 or HF-3 missiles. Okay, now these will further allow dispersal of naval firepower from about a dozen or so fishing harbors that they can operate from, the current crop of missile boats that could operate from, to about 100. An order of magnitude more of dispersal, greater dispersal. So asymmetry can apply not only to the Army, but also potentially to naval and air forces. Taiwan's also, of course, but ODC or asymmetry is about more than, and this is one of the things that Taiwan has actually evolved, able to evolve on their own. It's about more than just hardening. It's more than about just force preservation. They're also developing rapid mine laying capabilities. They're also asking the U.S. for aerial deployed sea mines like Quick Strike. They're also putting greater emphasis on mobile, redundant surface search radars and command capabilities that are essential to keeping any shore-based or asymmetrical maritime attack platforms viable, because small boats are not going to have their own sensors. They're going to have to rely on, I believe one of the presenters talked about that earlier. Moreover, since Taiwan recognizes that they depend on seaborne trade for not just its economic lifeline, but perhaps even more importantly, its energy security, because Taiwan imports 98% of its energy needs, right? Including 48% petroleum, 29% coal, and 13% LNG. Taiwan has less than 60 days petroleum reserves and only about a week's supply of LNG, on which 36% of Taiwan's electricity generation depends. So, which translates out to, in the summer, roughly 6 days. Okay, LNG. So therefore, Taiwan recognizes, we probably need to hold out for maybe 2-3 weeks, at least. But if we don't somehow try to at least make an effort to safeguard our energy security, the war could be over, well before any meaningful intervention could take place. So therefore, ASW and broad area ISR will continue to remain very important mission requirements, even in the context of a major war. In other words, they're not going to be able to abandon those mission requirements. Whether they're going to be able to spend as much as they previously wanted to, that's a separate matter. So therefore, Taiwan still has requirements for such systems as the MH-60R Romeo multi-role naval helicopter and the MQ-8B Fire Scout UAV to help develop and enhance their ISR capabilities. And despite much of the tension being typically focused on air and naval power, ground forces continue to be an important element in Taiwan's defense, especially since I believe one of the speakers had alluded to it earlier. It's easier to make ground forces more survivable. Okay. And despite the tremendous growth and modernization of the Chinese amphibious power projection capabilities, PLA presently still lacks the large number of amphibious landing ships that will be required to conduct major invasion against Taiwan. And even though China possesses the ability to launch amphibious assault from beyond the horizon, using a combination of hovercraft, high-speed amphibious assault vehicles, and helicopters, in the foreseeable future, they're unlikely to be able to land more than a brigade-sized force from the littoral zone, that is about 40 to 50 clicks offshore, within the first 48 hours of D-Day. So therefore, there are significant geographical challenges. Moreover, there are significant geographical challenges for amphibious invasion scenario. For example, as Admiral Chen had remarked on earlier, given the general lack of landing beaches of suitable width and depth, particularly in northern Taiwan, a major amphibious assault against the island will be very difficult and at best very time-consuming to implement. Taiwan will only be able to land relatively small forces, less than battalion strength, at any one time. And even then, only at very few sites which could be properly defended with prepared defenses and layered firepower in place. So therefore, Taiwan's ground forces may still well possess both numerical superiority as well as the defensive advantage, at least during the early stages of an anti-invasion battle. And to capitalize on these advantages, Taiwan's ground forces are adopting a number of new force modernization measures, and they're starting to explore other options. The Army has been the most enthusiastic among Taiwan's military services to embrace the overall defense concept and asymmetry. They obviously see ODC as a possible venue to afford ground forces a larger, more important role, not to mention more meaningful share of the budget. And one of the things that they're looking to do is to extend the battle space. New emphasis on the littoral battle versus the old beach shore battle means that engagements can now begin at, instead of 5 to 8 clicks offshore, they're looking at potentially 40 to 50 clicks. And this has important implications for the types of procurement and requirements that are needed. Some of the things they're already looking at include extended range rocket artillery, battlefield support missiles, and they're also looking to diversify the means of precision engagement. In addition to the traditional reliance on anti-ship missiles, Taiwan is looking at long-range guided artillery rounds, including everything from Excalibur to Bonus to Volcano, to also thinking about the use of sensor-fused weapons, or SADARM, as either artillery, rocket-delivered, or air-delivered munition payloads, and ground-launched ARMs, anti-radiation missiles, as a way of attacking ships that are goalkeeping for the anchorage. They're also looking at ways to lowering the cost of precision attacks, including the possible use of guided rockets like APKWS, LOGIR, and ground-launched guided bombs. In another area that Taiwan, and given the defensive advantages afforded by Taiwan's geography, certain types of more traditional firepower are again being given renewed attention. Tube artillery is one of the few system types that can deliver flexible and sustained fire against a wide range of target sets at different ranges during different phases of the layered anti-invasion battle, and at relatively low cost per unit ammunition or per target. However, Taiwan's artillery, which consists of equipment that's at least 30 years old, and some of which have technology that dates back to the end of the First World War, including the 114 howitzer, there is therefore a real sense of urgency for the need to modernize Taiwan's artillery. Now, however, the Taiwanese Army has their work cut out for them. They need to develop a more rigorous and robust justification for its modernization requirements in the context of the littoral battle, precision engagement, and layered fire. So therefore, how to deal with the requirements of the extended battle space, different types of targets and required effects. For example, what would you need between the range and the type of ammunition that you're going to use to engage amphibious warfare ships at anchorage, amphibious assault vehicles and hovercraft during the assault phase, and beach landing. These require different mixes of capabilities. And the optimal combination or compromise solution of ordnance, the gun, and ammunition. Should it be precision guided, rocket assisted, cargo round with smart submunitions? And these must be convincingly addressed in order to win support for programs from the Taiwan government leadership. I think I'm running out of time, right? Do I have time to wrap up? All right.
It pains me to stop you from speaking because you do it so eloquently. But I do want to give our audience some time to, one, hopefully digest these 2 hours of panels. It's been a lot of information thrown at you, a lot of acronyms, a lot of hope but also a lot of concern. So I'll pass it over to the audience for any questions. Scott? You can say your name and affiliation. That would be great.
Sure. Okay, great. Scott Harold from the RAND Corporation. I just want to try and get a dialogue between Fu Mei and Jim Thomas with maybe the other panelists brought in. You know, Fu, you said China could invade in 2020. That's a year from now. And Xi Jinping did just give orders to get ready for war. And on the other hand, for years we've had the notion that Taiwan needs to move in a direction of greater asymmetry, maybe all the way, or maybe just adding it because that's all that's politically sustainable. But Jim and General Gregson and others, I suspect you would agree with me when you say Taiwan looks like a country that's preparing for possible conflict someday. Sure doesn't look to me like a country that thinks, I am going to be invaded, my women and children enslaved, and all of the males executed a year from now. What is the status of Taiwan's approach to this problem? Is it still in a kind of, let's get ready leisurely mode, or does the ODC represent to you an urgent, aggressive, and appropriate response to a real, imminent, existential challenge?
Should we bring up the Cavalon really quickly?
Yeah. Cavalon first for this.
Would you, Fu or Jim, any of you want to tackle that question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think you nailed it on the head, which is the idea of saying I'm going to have a carve out for overall defense concept, but I can keep kind of doing business as usual for this balanced joint force. Those days ended like 2 decades ago. I mean, we are out of time. And I think there's a question here as a security partner, is Taiwan serious? Because this is not serious, And the days of thinking like you can have a conventional defense and you can think about, Navy on Navy engagements or Air Force on Air Force engagement, those days are they've been over for a long time. And I just look and say, what's the point of putting sinking all this money into like a preferential air-based defense concept? Do you really think you're going to have a chance in this fight on the defensive? Just how much money do you want to pour into concrete? How much money do you want to pour into Patriot air defenses? And I look and say, the only good news in all of this is amphibious assaults are super hard. As a matter of fact, I think it's foolhardy for any country to think about an amphibious assault, including our own. But I would say you got to still honor the threat that the PLA clearly is preparing for this. And so, as I was saying earlier, I think you've got to go to a radically different approach. It's going to be more guerrilla-like and more unconventional than clearly what most people in the strategic studies community in Taipei are thinking about. And this idea of we can just buy people off by doing a little of this asymmetric stuff and then it's back to business as usual, I just think that's nuts. I mean, you're going to lose support amongst Americans who actually care about, the security of Taiwan. And I think that's a really dangerous game to play.
I think if I can put a two-finger to that, is I've had discussions. I mean, David, you and I talked about this yesterday or a few days ago, the difference between peacetime and wartime. And I think perhaps what, Scott, what you're talking about, and Jim, what you're saying is that Taiwan's leadership needs to rapidly mobilize their citizens to be in wartime mind frame. And that's a tall ask. That's a tall order. And I'm of the mind that I think Taiwan's people do take their defense very seriously. And I say that in respects to it is their lives, it is their children's lives, it is their grandchildren's lives. They have their family, their friends, their pets. And for me to think that the people in Taiwan are not taking their defense seriously, I think I want to temper that just a little bit because they live on that island. They've been under this threat for decades.
Can I just two-finger? I'm sorry, but the reality is that this all is all dependent on third-party intervention. Okay, if there is no third-party intervention, back to the Melian dialogue because that's your answer. Okay, and the only way you're going to get a third-party answer is you got a third-party intervention. You've got to show you're totally serious. Yeah. And it's one thing to be attacked and say, "Am I going to put my people at risk if I'm attacked?" It's another thing if you're halfway around the world to say, am I going to intervene and put my people at risk? And that's an even bigger ask.
Which is why I think it's a shame that over the last 10 to 12 years, the United States has not done arms sales to Taiwan. If it's so dire, if it's 1 year, there's going to be war, then why aren't we sending flag officers to Taiwan immediately? If we are going to come to the aid of Taiwan under the TRA, then why don't we display more political courage to say that we, and to provide morale to the people of Taiwan and their forces that we are here to support this rapid, perhaps, shift from peacetime to wartime.
Rachel, if I could just add one other thought. Jim's characterization is, if Taiwan is not serious enough, maybe if I take your meaning correctly, maybe the United States won't show up. But I think it's even more important to point out, China gets a vote in this. China may start such a conflict with an attack on U.S. bases in Japan. So what Taiwan does, if Taiwan effectively deters the start of an attack or not, may have direct implications for the United States, which may not get to choose to stay out even. We might be struck first because China thinks we'll do the knockout punch, we'll cripple America's structure in the Western Pacific, and then we'll go hard at Taiwan. They may not try to keep us out by saying, this is not your thing, this is just intra-Chinese, Taiwan's part of China, don't come in. They may not give us that choice. So what Taiwan does, the United States definitely has a right to speak. So this is where I would disagree with you a little bit, I think, Rachel. The United States definitely has a right to tell Taiwan, if we think we're not seeing enough motion in this direction, we need you to do more. My view. And it's, of course, it's meant with goodwill. I mean, everyone, many of us in this room who care about Taiwan actually have family there too.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. That's why it's fun to have. I don't think anyone here disagrees. And the beauty of it is that the U.S. and Taiwan have this great relationship, and we're allowed to have these dialogues among friends. So, boo. And also, but before I go to you, if there's other questions in the audience, as moderator and organizer of this event, I'm going to extend the time a little bit. So, Fu.
Well, I think I want to temper a lot of the discussions. I think I'm the kind of guy that always wants to take the middle ground here, and I'm also very realistic, because I think it's better that Taiwan starts to adopt asymmetry, a la ODC, than none at all. Right? It's never too late to start. Okay? Taiwan had 10 years time to chew over it. And only in the last 15 months have they started to start looking at this seriously. And there's been an enormous amount of resistance, right? So I don't think it's constructive enough for us just to say, well, no, that's not enough. To go half-assed is not enough. No, half-assed is 3,000 times better than whatever they had before. Secondly, I think the U.S. has some responsibility. To say that we're out of time, we were looking at 2 years, 1 year, 4 years, 6 years. U.S. at 10 years, okay? Ever since Bill Murray came out with the porcupine, right? But as I have presented in a previous U.S. Taiwan Defense Industry Conference, I think the U.S. has had, number one, has a double standard. Number two, has been in some ways hypocritical, because it's asymmetry, and this sort of asymmetrical defense involves more than, I don't have time to read through all my presentation. Involves more than just hardening, right? I talked about low probability of intercept, frequency hopping radios. I talk about other forms of camouflage. But U.S. was not willing to release these technologies. So I cannot accept that Taiwan wasn't trying to do more, because, okay, U.S. could say, all right, but that's not really our thing. Export policy is, it's sometimes beyond our immediate ability to influence. But still, you helped Taiwan waste these last 10 years, okay? So that's the second point. The third point is, 2020 could be the earliest date. It may not be. Okay? It could be 2022. It could be after China has achieved minimal economic well-being for the entire country. 全国整体经济小康, right? So we don't know what that point is, and we don't know what other internal factors could trigger it. But I think it's much better for Taiwan to get moving, okay? And what are you gonna do with the 340 fighters and the 28 major surface combatants that have in service? You're gonna mothball all of them so that we can all devote all of our resources, not just the procurement resources, but also enemy resources to asymmetrical or ODC. I think we need to be practical and realistic in our approach. And I think a phased one, I think is probably more beneficial than try to stuff the thing wholesale down Taiwan's throat.
I can't resist jumping in on this. Nobody's asking Taiwan to decommission its ships or its airplanes. The best airplane, the most advanced airplane, the most advanced ship, if fought stupidly, is going to fail. What we're talking about is developing a concept that takes advantage of what we're doing. Rachel asked earlier, and we didn't get a chance to finish it, how much training time is needed to do with the ground forces what we're talking about? There's training time needed. What more important thing do the ground forces have to do in peacetime than to train? But the more important thing here is what's required is a respectable length of service of the people entering not only the ground forces, but the other services. And this is back to the strategic concept again. And one of the audiences is the best and the brightest amongst the young people in Taiwan. They have to believe in what the armed forces are doing. They have to believe that it stands a chance of being successful and that they can make a significant contribution to this. And I admit that my past is checkered with 5 years on recruiting duty when times were tough on this. But the solutions to all this are not going to be people of our age. The solution to all this is going to be the bright young people that figure out better ways to do things. So you have to attract the best and the brightest to come to the aid of Taiwan and develop ODC further with all the rich intellectual property that Admiral Chun put in there. And there's not a destination here. It's not like by 2019 in March, we're going to have a doctrine set and we're going to go forward. No, it's got to keep morphing and changing as opportunities present themselves. And again, it's going to come from bottom up. And that's going to be the key to it. A speaker at the U.S. Taiwan Business Conference spent a lot of time talking about the inherent advantages to a military that is drawn from a free society. In Mark Stokes' talk, one of the things that occurred to me is that a society that controls information that is rigidly hierarchical, like the CCP and the PRC and the PLA, they're going to have problems changing on the fly. On the other hand, the normal, shall we say, inherent insubordination that exists amongst the average soldier, sailor, airman, marine that's grown up thinking for him or herself serves us well when things go bad on communication, et cetera, et cetera. But the foundation of it and a major contribution to deterrence is going to be to improve the ability of the Taiwan Armed Forces. And there's a lot of dots to connect in this, but I fear that unless something changes, not only will the United States and many people in the United States not be convinced that Taiwan is defendable, but people in Taiwan may be convinced that Taiwan's not defendable. We got to get the discussion going. We got to get out there and we got to have a give and take on this to decide all the rich details in it in a forum that's entirely appropriate and develop something that never allows Xi Jinping to wake up, whether there's a fight going on in Korea at the same time, a fight going on in Japan at the same time, and say, this is the day I can take Taiwan. We want to have enough that he's deterred from doing that.
I think actually that might be a really wonderful place to end this elongated panel. And I hopefully after this, everyone will have some time to come up to the panelists and ask your own individual questions. And I apologize for not giving you too much space to ask questions. But please give us a round of applause, the panelists here. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And happy Halloween.
Hey. Oh, great.